Good morning. Um, this morning I would like to topic of identity. Um, so first I'd like to begin in James chapter 1, and we'll be looking at verses 22 to 25. Just for just to let you all know what you find in this verse or this chapter, I got this sermon off of TikTok. So I won't be taking credit for this, right? I have this guy that I follow, and he usually has a lot of very interesting things to say. So I saw this, what was it, like Tuesday night, I think, and it kind of gave me an idea of something that I probably should share. So in James chapter 1 and starting at verse 22, it says, "But be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. So if any be a hearer of the word, and not a doer, he is like unto a man, beholding his natural face in a glass. For he beholdeth himself, and goeth his way, and straightway forgetteth what manner of man he was. But whoso looketh into the perfect law of liberty, and continueth therein, he being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed in his deed. May God bless the reading of his word to us for his name's sake. Amen." So I'd like to look specifically at verses 23 and 24. So it says, "If any be a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like unto a man beholding his natural face in a glass. For he beholdeth himself and goeth his way, and straightway forgetteth what manner of man he was." So when you look at that analogy that James gives us, that you have a man who looks at himself in the mirror, and then as he turns his back, he forgets what manner of man he was. It is a bit strange almost because unless you're a very forgetful person, I'd like to imagine that most of us have an idea of kind of what we look like, right? So when you look in the mirror and you turn your back to the mirror, you're not going to forget what you look like immediately. You'll have an idea of what you look like. So why is it that James here says that if a man is a hero but not a doer, it comes like he's a man who looks in a glass, he looks in a mirror, and he turns away and he forgets what he looks like. So to understand what he means by that, we have to go to John chapter 1. And before we look at John chapter 1, we have to go all the way back to the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth. Because in Genesis chapter 1, I think it's like down to verses 25 and 26, it talks about, and God said, "Let us make man in our own image and in our own likeness," right? So we have in James a man who looks in the mirror but doesn't know what he looks like when he turns away, right? And in Genesis chapter 1, we we see that we are made in God's image and in his likeness. So when you now look at John chapter 1, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God." And as you skip down, you see where it says in verse 14, "And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." So I hope this morning that you understand that when we are told that we are made in the image and likeness of God, that that means that we are made to reflect God, right? That is what that means. That when people look at us, they are supposed to see God. So in John chapter 1, where it says that in the beginning was the Word, and we understand that this is referring to Jesus, and Jesus was with God, and Jesus was God, right? And later on, it shows us that the Word was made flesh. So we are speaking of Jesus. What this means here is that when you look back in James and you look at that man who looks at himself in the mirror and he turns away and he forgets who he was, a mirror is a reflection. So when you look at a mirror, it's a reflection of something. So when that man hears the word, he looks in the mirror and he sees what he's supposed to look like because the word, which is Jesus, who is also God, is who we're made in the image of. So when the man hears the word and he looks in the mirror, he sees what he looks like. But however, this man in James, he's not a doer of the word. So he hears the word, he looks in the mirror, he sees what he looks like, and he turns away, and immediately his identity is lost. He forgets who he is because he is not a doer of the word. And this is what I am speaking of this morning. Now, I think it was like early this year. We had something in church, and Barry came to that meeting, and afterwards we had a conversation, right? And if you know Brother Hugh, Barry's like Brother Hugh in that no conversation with Barry is straightforward. When you get in a conversation with him, you're going down some kind of rabbit hole you never went down before. You're going somewhere to talk about something you're not comfortable with, something you never thought of, that kind of thing, right? So this conversation I had with Barry was also about identity, right? So before I finish that story, I just have a couple of questions to ask, right? So my brother here in the red street, who are you? Nathan, right? My next brother in the red street, who are you? Who is he? You know, come on, Shania. Who are you? Shania? Right. So so I asked three people who they are, and I get Nathan, Christian, and Shania, right? So talking to Barry, he asked me, who am I? So I say, I'm Zachary. He say, but who are you? So at this point, I know we going somewhere, but I don't know what Barry really trying to get at, right? So Barry asked, but who are you? Well, so I didn't, really know what to say, right? So he pointed me to, in the same John chapter 1, later down, it talks in verse, you could go to verse 19 for reference, right? So in John chapter 1, we are talking here about now John the Baptist. So he pointed me to this piece of scripture. So John chapter 1, verse 19. And this is the record of John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, who art thou? And he confessed and denied not, but confessed, I am not the Christ. And they asked him, what then? Art thou Elias? And he said, I am not. Art thou that prophet? And he answered, no. Then they said unto him, who art thou, that we may give an answer to them that sent us? What sayest thou of thyself? He said, I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as said the prophet Isaiah. So when you look at John the Baptist, and he had persons who were sent by the religious leaders of the time, they went to John the Baptist to ask him who he was. And what was his response? His response was not that I am John the Baptist. His response wasn't that uh, he was the cousin of Jesus. But what was his response? His response was that I'm the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord. So here we see that when they asked John the Baptist, who was he? That he had a clear identity, that he knew this is who he was. He knew that this is what he came to do. So in the same conversation with Barry, as he pointed that out to me, he also explained that when we deal with the spiritual world, as it were, that Satan and his minions, they would also have an idea of what your identity is. They might not have the full picture, they might not know everything, but they'd have an idea of what your purpose is. So they would know that Nathan is just not Nathan, but Nathan is a young man who is destined to be best welder in Trinidad and going to use his welding platform to preach the gospel, right? They're not going to just look at Shania and see Shania, but they'll see somebody who's going to be a doctor who going to walk in the hospital and say, pick up your bed, get up and walk out, and patients going to pick up their bed and get up and walk out to the hospital, right? That's what they see, right? So Satan is very good at when he knows what you are here for, he'll put things in a way to make sure that you forget your identity. He'll put things in a way to make sure that you no longer become a doer of the word and you become like that man who looks in the mirror and he turns away and he forgets who he is. A good example I could use is of myself, right? So usually I would say that I'm a very quiet person. I'm not one for confrontations and that sort of stuff, that sort of things, right? But when I drive, which is unfortunately very often, I'm always on the road, I tend to take Jesus out the front seat and put him in the back seat. So you're no longer dealing with quiet Zachary who don't want any problems. But I begin to drive, especially if I'm in a bad mood, on what I call the principle of the matter, right? So example of this is that if I'm driving and I see someone angled a certain way, which usually indicates that they are turning in a certain direction, right? As I'm approaching them, I don't see an indicator on, I'd purposefully not let that person through because I'm not a mind reader. Please put in the indicator, right? That is how I operate. But of course, it's not necessarily the best thing to do, right? So what you notice that, especially if I'm in a bad mood, that is the day that I bounce up all the worst drivers in Trinidad. That is the day when you find people who driving in the right side of the road at 60 kilometers, who driving in between two lanes, who switching lane in the middle of a roundabout. All kind of madness it is meet, right? So when I'm in a bad mood, Satan know that this is the day to come and to test me, right? So you'll find that when I'm driving, that I lose my identity as this quiet person, as this person who's supposed to be patient, as the Bible calls me to be patient, as this person who's supposed to be loving and understanding. So on these days, I tend to lose my identity, right? And another great example of this could be found in the story of the prodigal son. So if you quickly turn to Luke chapter 15, we can look at the story, right? And verses 11, we won't go all the way down to 32, but verses 11 to about 16. So Luke chapter 15, 11 to 16. Right, and he said, a certain man had two sons, and the young of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husk that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. Verse 17 as well. And when he came to himself, he said, how many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? So a very popular passage, a passage that I would like to think that most of us know. We're looking at the prodigal son, right? And in the story, it starts off with him going to his father, and he basically asks his dad to give him his inheritance early, and he takes all his money, all his inheritance. He goes to a foreign land, and he spends all his money partying, doing whatever the case may be, right? And then later on in the story now, when he's all out of money and he has no food, he takes on a job to feed pigs. And he's so hungry at that point that he starts to look at the pig food, and the pig food is looking appetizing to him. So, but in verse 17, we see he realizes that he has lost his identity. He realizes that this is not who I am. Because in verse 17, he talks about how his father has many hired servants who have enough bread and to spare, and yet he perishes with hunger. Now, at this point, he also doesn't even realize his full identity, so to speak, because he was thinking that he could go back to his father as a servant, right? Not as his son. So he realizes that he has gotten himself in such a big hole that he has lost his identity, that now he is looking to eat pig food, when really and truly his father is someone who could take care of all his needs. So as the story continues, of course, he gets back up, he goes back to his father, and his father welcomes him with open arms, right? But here we see a great example of someone who they should have had an idea of who they were. He should have known who his father was. But because he went and did things that he was not supposed to do, he lost that identity. But thankfully, in the end, he was able to regain it, right? So this morning, I would just like us to reflect on the fact that we were made in God's image and in his likeness. Reflect on the fact that our identity is found in not only being a hearer of the word, but also a doer of the word. Because when you hear the word, you look in the mirror and you see what it's supposed to look like. But it's not until you actually abide by the word and you do the word that you truly see and identify the person that you're supposed to be, right? I could use Grace as an example for this, because in Youth Meeting Friday, we asked, why do you come to Youth Meeting, right? And Gracie said because when he goes to school, he could go and tell everybody what he learned in Youth Meeting, right? So hopefully that is the truth. So hopefully In school, when people talk about Kwesi and they ask who is Kwesi, they'll say, oh, Kwesi is that Jesus boy who come and telling us about youth group, right? That is what Kwesi's identity becomes. But it cannot be that when he's in school, he's saying one thing, but he's doing that next thing. Because if he says one thing and he does the next thing, then you see that contradiction there. You see where his identity will be lost. Because no, he's no longer Kwesi, the Jesus boy, but he's now Kwesi, the hypocrite. Because Kwesi telling us one thing about youth group, but Kwesi living a different life. You know what I mean? So let us be encouraged that as we go through this walk, first of all, of course, the first step is that you hear the word. So you hear the word, you study the word, you read the word. That's the first step. But you don't stop there. You also have to be doers of the word. You have to take the word, you have to take what you learn and apply it in your life. So that we will not be like the man who looks in the mirror and when he turns away, he forgets who he is. Amen.